In this module, we'll be thinking about some of the fundamental steps, particularly at the beginning of your research, and the ethical considerations that you need to be aware of in doing your educational research. In order to do that, you'll be reading 2 chapters from Creswell. They're very detailed, but very helpful chapters, so you'll find all of that detail very important. You'll also be reading 2 additional readings by Magolda and Weems, and the second by Hostetler, that you'll be able to access under the Required Readings tab for Module 2. In addition to the readings listed here, you'll be participating in the forum. This is the first regular forum that we'll be having for our course, and you'll be completing Part B of the observation assignment and also doing the genre comparison assignment. I want to look particularly at the genre comparison assignment before we go on and talk more about the readings. All right, of course, you'll go to assignment description, samples, rubrics, and resources. You'll look for the genre comparison, and you'll hit the file, and then the articles are going to come up first, and the rubric will be second. So we'll look at those very briefly first. Okay, let's get this up. All right, so the thing I want to mention to you in doing the comparison is that you pay attention to the fact that you are to do either 1-1 and 1-2 or 2-1 and 2-2. Sorry about that. And I mention this because I did have a student who mistook that part of the assignment and actually chose, I think it was 1-1 and 2-2. And the problem with that is these have been chosen because each of these pairs are about the same research project. They're just written up in a very different way. So one is for an academic audience and the other is for a professional audience. The second one, the same thing. The same research project is written up for both a professional audience and an academic audience. And so, so it's important that you look at the same study, and what you're going to be focusing on, of course, is what is the difference in communicating that study to an academic audience and to a professional audience. As an author, what kinds of things do you need to be thinking about? As a reader, what awareness do you have to have in order to be able to make your way through each of these assignments? Of course, as you'll find, the professional journal is going to be more accessible because it's meant for you as an educational professional. An academic audience is something that's a little bit different, has different kinds of criteria for measuring how successful that author is in writing up that study and so on. So as you look at these 2 pairs, you're going to choose one of them. So you may want to just have a quick look at them and just see what they're about and see if there's any match. There doesn't have to be to your own kinds of interests, and in most cases there won't be. But that's okay, because what's important is for you to be focusing on how it is that that particular author speaks to a particular audience. What are the differences between them? All right, I also want to pay attention to the rubric. So let's have a look at that. The colorful one is a little more fun to look at, so we'll look at that one. And so in this case, what we have is, I'm going to just move this over a little bit so you can see the whole thing. All right, so what we have is the various components of the assignment that are listed down here. So these are the criteria and what kinds of marks have been assigned to each. And then there's a description of that particular criteria. And then there is a rubric that goes into the various parts of that rubric that are being looked for as, and then adjudicated as excellent, good, needs improvement, needs significant improvement, and then the mark will be adjudicated here. So, so this is important to have a look at. What are the kinds of things that we're actually looking for here? And of course, what you're doing in this course is multiple are multiple things. So you're preparing to write academically, and of course you've been doing that for some time now, but in a particular way for a research audience, an academic research audience. So there are certain kinds of written presentation norms that are expected, and so they are listed here. And then you go across the various levels of that criteria. Same for summary of the research topic, comparison of similarities, differences, etc., and then your concluding reflection. So, so this is a handy piece of work to have a look at so that you have a clear idea of what's involved. All right, having done the comparison assignment, there is one thing else that I'd like to just make a brief mention of, because we'll be talking about it more, of course, in Module 3. But I want you to look ahead at the literature review part 1. Just have a look at what's expected, what kinds of things are looked for in the rubric, etc. But your pre-preparation will be to start thinking, and you'll start thinking in this particular module, about what it is that you actually, what kind of area of potential research are you looking at? Because your literature review can be very helpful in preparing you for that. So there may be 1 or 2 or 3 different areas. You might want to kind of do a very quick look at how much literature actually is available, etc., because that becomes important in doing your research, of course. And also just a quick look at what kinds of things look interesting and so on. And then narrowing that focus down to at least 1 or 2, or no more than 1 or 2, let's put it that way, and preferably 1, because you can use your literature review assignment as a preparatory step to your actual literature, or sorry, your actual research project. So you can use that time for that. Now, it doesn't have to be, and you may change your mind after the fact, and that's fine, because this assignment also prepares you for doing this part of your research project, which is completing a literature review that's going to be helpful to you in completing your actual research. So I just put that forward as a kind of pre-assignment so that you can start thinking about that. And I know this is a busy module because you're finishing up one assignment and moving on to the next assignment, but maybe at the back of your mind you can be just kind of letting that percolate away. And you certainly don't have to have completed that before Module 3, but just, you know, do some of the pre-thinking around that as you're driving home from work or whatever. All right. So let's go on then to what are we going to be talking about, or what are you going to be learning about in the readings that are coming up? Well, first of all, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on Creswell because he explains the information so well, so clearly, that it really becomes self-evident in so many ways. So you don't need me for that part of the process. Chapters 3 and 4 will be very helpful and will be the ones that you'll go back to probably again and again as you move forward with your research. They really do provide the kind of nitty-gritty that are the things that you need to be doing and thinking about as you're doing your research. In Chapter 3, he talks about purpose statements, research questions, hypotheses, and objectives, and how to differentiate between them in quantitative and in qualitative research. Now, I'll put this forward right now. You'll be doing 99% of you, 99.9% of you, probably 100% of you will be doing qualitative research for your actual research project, and there are multiple reasons for that. I know some of you may be more interested in quantitative research, but as you move forward in the process, you'll begin to realize why in this particular program that might not be a possibility. However, it's still important to know some of the basics around quantitative research and how you come to questions, hypotheses, and so on. He claims that each of these, that is, purpose statements, research questions, hypotheses, and objectives, are important because they provide research signposts, and those signposts are important to think about and state clearly for both the researcher and the reader or the consumer of that research. Another metaphor might be a touchstone, that is, something that a researcher can refer to be sure they're on the right track. When you're writing a fairly large document, it's very easy actually to go off track, to find a trail that looks kind of interesting, and off you go. And what you end up doing is not what you said you were going to do in the process. So returning to that signpost is always important to ensure that what you're doing is what you said that you were going to be doing. The reader can use them as a way to see what's going to be explored and then adjudicate whether in fact that is what the researcher does. And as a reader, for example, for doctoral thesis hearings and so on, this is something that I pay close attention to. I look at what the person said they were going to do, and then I ask myself at the end, is that in fact what the researcher did? And of course that's one way to adjudicate what happened in between. I'm not going to go into any further detail because, as I mentioned, Creswell is so clear and precise in his presentation of all of this information. But I want to reiterate that each of these signposts is very important in your own thinking before, during, and after your research project. Before you begin researching, it is essential to determine precisely what it is that this study will do. During the research, these signposts are checks to ensure you are doing what you set out to do. And after your research project is complete, this is a way to check that in fact you did what you said you would. So these are very, very important steps in the process. The literature review is a key step in your research, and of course this is what you're going to be doing, not a mini version of, but a shorter version of in your next assignment following this module's assignment. And Creswell considers the practical steps in identifying the focus for your search, locating literature, critically evaluating, and selecting the literature that you use for your research, then organizing and writing up your literature review. The literature review enables us to learn what is already known about the phenomenon we wish to explore. I mean, we have to ask ourselves the question, is it worth going ahead if this question that I want to look at has already been explored in some detail in the literature? Or is there some aspect of that question that I could think about differently and explore differently? So the literature review reveals that to us. The key terms will come out of a potential title and preliminary research focus or question. Once you've put together some key terms, you can begin to locate the literature available. So here you see why that purpose statement, etc., become really important, because this helps you identify precisely what it is that you're going to be looking at. And then the research or the literature review helps you then to continue that search and start building upon it. Get to know your librarian. She's going, or he is going to be your best friend in locating the literature that you want to find. And you can do that if you're not in Edmonton itself. You can do that online by going to the chat room, etc. Also get to know the library website. Take some time to go through it. If you can get to a workshop, do that because they're really helpful. Or go to the library page and explore the resources that are available there. There's lots of stuff there, and it's not just for finding articles, but it tells you all kinds of things that are really helpful in doing the kinds of things that you need to do in your research process. Evaluate the literature you are identifying as potentially helpful. One way to do so is to actually use the library page because it has some useful information. For example, it will identify very often, not always, but very often, whether this is a professional journal or a peer-reviewed research journal, and so on. So then it helps you then evaluate the validity of that particular article or book or whatever it happens to be in supporting the research that you do. And it helps you answer the question, is this article or is this book from a legitimate peer-reviewed journal? Is this of value to my study? You will need to evaluate whether this article, which may be very worthy and actually very interesting, actually enhances your understanding of your research problem or question. And, and that's where we can get into some issues or it could be helpful in kind of shifting your focus ever so slightly or perhaps substantially to something that is more appropriate or something that you're more interested in. So the literature review helps you do all of that. So these are important steps in this whole process. All right, so Magolda and Weems' article introduces an essential part of doing research, and that is ethics. It's an interesting, it's an accessible article, and it takes on the important ethical dilemmas that researchers encounter when working with human or animal subjects. If you've done any research, you're well aware of the many issues they raise, and even better, if you haven't, it's excellent for ensuring that new researchers are attuned to the ethics of doing research, particularly in qualitative research. Not that they don't emerge in quantitative work, because they very much do, and Hostetler gives us some examples of that actually, but the effects tend to be muted to some degree by the less direct interaction between researcher and subject. Magolda and Weems focus in particular on qualitative research, in which you are building relationships of trust between the researcher and those being researched. And that relationship raises some very significant ethical dilemmas. Of course, each institution has their own ethical guidelines, and your board probably has those, for example. Certainly the university has some financial institutions, if you're doing research in that area, for example, will have them, and so on. And they'll have guidelines about review processes that must be considered and your research approved before it can proceed. And that can take some time, so this is an important consideration for a researcher. For example, if you need to get a project done quickly, you're not going to go to a board that is well known to take well over 6 months, for example, to get back to you about approving your ethics review. The ethics board at the university is a working committee, a very hard working committee, I've been on that committee, that must approve any research that uses human subjects. Therefore, everyone who is researching human subjects must have their research approved based on the university criteria, and each university will have their own criteria based on a national criteria that each of us must meet. And those criteria are set by national bodies that actually regulate the process as well. So approvals are regularly monitored, and universities take this process very seriously because, for one thing, you can actually have your funding withdrawn if it doesn't meet the standards that are put forward by that national body. But that actually doesn't end the ethical responsibility you hold. As you embark on a qualitative study, your relationship with participants is premised on trust. But the nature of qualitative research is that you are building knowledge together so that you don't know with certainty what might emerge. Therefore, and it can emerge in the relationships that you built, for example. Therefore, the respondent, that is the person being researched or the group being researched, trusts that you will take care in the research that you do together. So Magolda and Weems go into some of the dilemmas that have come up in their own research that exemplify the kinds of quandaries that all qualitative researchers have encountered. For example, gatekeepers, that might be the superintendent or principal, or respondents, who might be teachers or parents or community members, may be really excited that you want to research their work or their school or their board or whatever, and have said yes before really being aware of what you have tried to fully disclose as possible risks. And they might read it later on and say, no, withdrawing. So it's important to really negotiate that process very carefully in getting your ethics approval from those that you're going to research. Do you stop, or do you continue with possible negative effects if they start to waver about whether they're going to participate? There may be harm to the broader community as well if your research becomes public, for example, and human subjects can be identified. This is particularly difficult. That is, if you promise them that they will not be identified and they end up being identified and that identification becomes public, this can be of significant concern for those who have been researched and for you, the researcher. Or the research may be used by others to the detriment of the community, and we've seen many examples of this, particularly in First Nations communities. Therefore, as researchers, we have to act ethically and with great sensitivity and do what we can to prevent harm. There's also potential harm to the researcher as well. The emotional labor of working through these issues can be emotionally wearing, or if you make the wrong decision, your reputation may be affected. Revelations may trigger psychologically harmful responses and so on. And as we think through what may happen during the research process, we need to think about any potential harms to ourselves, but particularly to others. And so it becomes really important to pre-think all of this during the ethics process. And that means that you and your participants are prepared for most of the predictable, or, that we can pre-think eventualities. And all of that requires sensitivity and a relationship of mutual trust if something unexpected happens. Now, don't let this, put you off. And I've had some students who, after reading this article, actually think, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to research anything because potential harm could happen. And that's true of anything. I mean, potential harm can happen if we cross the street, but we do it all the time. What it requires is pre-thinking, being analytical about it ahead of time, and really thinking about the context in which you're going to be working so that you can predict any potential harm, and thinking about how you're going to handle that if something happens. So the key is to take account of the power issues. Who has the power to speak? Who doesn't? And how is that organized? Who has the power to reveal or conceal what is said? And of course, you as researcher are key to that as you write up your findings. And how can power relationships be mediated to better serve everyone's interest so that unforeseen harm does not occur? And of course, in all of this, you're balancing the harm potential with the possibility to do meaningful research. So Magolda and Hostetler talks about that in the next article. So Magolda and Weems use examples from their own research to illustrate the complex negotiations that may be a part of ethical qualitative research, and in doing so offer us an instructive article that expands our understanding of the complex nature of ethical research, in which we balance the potential for harm and end up with something that we can be proud of. Having raised some ethical dilemmas, Magolda and Weems go on to provide some possibilities consider in order to mitigate the possibility of harm. And each of these points raise things that you as a researcher can think about and take care of ahead of time. You can plan for some of the things that might happen. You're going to forewarn participants of inevitable or potential harm. You're going to be reflective and ask yourself questions without, as I mentioned before, kind of following into paralysis about going forward, but thinking ahead about what is potentially going to happen and making plans for or forestalling that possibility. You need to get to know the context within which you're operating for your research so that you can be particularly sensitive to any of the cultural, class, racial, ethnic, language, religious sensitivities that there might be. And you need to recognize that research writing is a political process. There are people and things that will win and will lose, depending on the choices that are made. So it's important to think about this sensitively and work this through, hopefully together with those that you're going to be researching. And of course, you do all of this with sensitivity, and you think carefully about how the data is going to be held, what's going to happen to it, and so on. And in that way, you maintain the integrity of the data. Last, we have the Hostetler article, which in some ways continues on many of the themes that Magolda and Weems raise. He considers what is good research. Up until now, our readings, for example, Creswell, have suggested that good research is research that is methodologically supportable. It's something that we could recommend as being done correctly or corresponds to best research practice. But Hostetler asks this question from the perspective of an education philosopher, particularly someone who is concerned about ethics, whose research specialization, in fact, is the study of ethics. And he makes a statement near the end of the paper that summarizes his discussion and raises really important possibilities for research in a larger philosophical sense. I'm going to take time to read that statement because I think it's an important one. As education researchers, we have a particular obligation and opportunity to take a leading role in seeing that the research that is done is truly good research. As we do our work, we need to think beyond questions of how we will study students or analyze school policies. We need to think about, although of course we'll do all of those things, but we need to think about how we can make life better for people. We need to think beyond our taken for granted ideas of well-being. And of course, this is very important in the ethics process. And what is good, and make those ideas the objects of serious communal inquiry. Serving people's well-being is a great challenge, but it is also our greatest calling. And in pursuing that calling, he offers some significant fodder for our discussions in Module 2 and the modules that will follow. And as you think about the research question that you're going to be pursuing and the way in which you will do that. So I hope that this video is helpful in framing some of the responsibilities and issues and dilemmas of doing good research. So I wish you well in that process, and if you have any questions as you go through these readings or certainly the assignments, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I look forward to reading your input in the forum. Take care.